Thank you, and thank you very much for the opportunity of being here with you on this particular day, and thank you for allowing us Scarlett into Osprey country. I really appreciate that. I had to show my passport on the way in, but it was accepted. Yeah, Camrini. Yeah, absolutely. Yes, it is an unashamed plug. Thank you for doing so. This is the latest work that I have published, and in thinking about the subject, Calvin James, I have to stop and make sure, of course, that by now, because he is actually a historical figure who died in 1983, I need to make sure that everybody here knows a little bit about who he actually was in the first place. I can't take that for granted anymore, although I have grown up with this whole thing about Calvin James, the mad rugby, the rugby icon. I was the one who was mad about him, the rugby icon. But of course, you can't assume now, these many years since he passed on, that we actually remember, especially if you have no interest in rugby. Apparently there are such people in Wales. I'm not exactly sure where they are. But Calvin James is known specifically for being a world-leading rugby coach. Quite simple statement to make. The British and Irish Lions have only ever won one Test series in New Zealand, and they did that in 1971, coached by Calvin James. The best club rugby team in the world.
Oh, careful.
The best club rugby team in the world. Still Ashley, in case you weren't sure, beat the All Blacks in 1972 under the coaching of Calvin James. For those two specific results, he has cemented himself in world rugby history, whoever you support. Okay, let's get that clear. And there are people in New Zealand who probably revere him far more than we actually do here in Wales, to be honest, because Graham Henry, the All Black coach and the former Welsh coach, acknowledges the fact that Calvin James was a massive influence on Graham Henry himself and on the development of rugby in New Zealand. And we all know how New Zealand have played their rugby for the last decades, unfortunately. But they have been absolutely superb and thrashing yesterday or today, whichever part of the hemisphere we were 57 now. But so that's how we know Calvin. But I haven't come here in the Yes Cymru event on Glyndŵr Day to speak about Calvin's rugby prowess, because why would I? What's the link? Why would I speak about Calvin, the rugby coach? Even that's where we know him, that's where he is known publicly, and that's where he is a celebrity. But what I argue in this book, which you can read for yourselves later if you so wish, is that we do Calvin a huge disservice if we confine him to the world of rugby. We do him a huge disservice if we think of him only as a rugby man. And in fact, I go further in here, and I say that I don't think that Calvin's heart was oval-shaped at all in the first place. Of course, he was a rugby genius, and that's not to belittle his rugby and his coaching contribution in any way, shape or form. But Calvin had four pillars in his life. He was a rugby man. There's a clip of the cover. He was a rugby man. He was also a broadcaster. I came across in the research for this book the first example of Calvin's broadcasting for the BBC in 1958, which is a really early example, and he broadcast in the late 50s, throughout the 60s, throughout the 70s, and into the first couple of years of the 80s before he died. He was a broadcaster. He was also a lecturer. He was a man of literature. He was the head of Welsh in Llandovery College. Adam said that he likes people who hold within themselves some contradictions. Now, there was nobody that was more true of than Calvin James. he was a man who was full of dualities. He was a chapel deacon in Tabernacle, Cynefin, who went to an Anglican establishment in Llandovery College. And he was a Welsh nationalist who coached the British and Irish Lions. Carwyn was full of dualities, so you would get along well with him if you liked such people. And that alludes to the other pillar in Carwyn's life, which was politics. He was a politician. He stood in the general election of 1970 for Plaid Cymru in Llanelli, and he secured over 8,500 votes in 1970. And that's quite a significant number of votes to secure at a time before the Lions beat the All Blacks, before Llanelli beat the All Blacks. So I wonder what would have happened if he would have stood in 1974 after his sporting successes, but he didn't. And I'll come on to maybe why that is the case before I finish. It is being quite useful. I have prepared a script for this evening. It's 420 pages long. So if you do want to leave by the time I get to page 200 or 300, I will understand. But what I would like to do, obviously, today, because of where we are and why we are here, is to look at Carwyn, the politician. When I started to write this book, I was going to organise the book according to the 4 pillars in his life. I gave that idea up fairly soon because I realised that the whole idea of Carwyn, the rugby man, would take up a large chunk. His broadcasting would take up a large chunk. His literature certainly would, because if I say that Carwyn wasn't a man whose heart was oval-shaped, I say that Carwyn at heart was a man of literature and he was a poet at heart, more than a man of rugby. So that would have taken a long time. And then I realised as well that if I organised a whole section on Carwyn, the politician, it would be very short. Because, as much as he was actively involved in politics, throughout many stages of his life, and I'll mention more on that later, I don't think he would have succeeded very well in the world of politics had he won that general election in 1970. I think that politics was a game that Carwyn specifically, the only game, he probably wasn't very good at, or he wouldn't have been very good at. But he did make a political contribution, and that's what I want to look at briefly, hopefully, we'll see, in the time that I got here this evening. So Carwyn did, as I've said, stand for Plaid Cymru. How did he become a Plaid Cymru member? Well, he was born in Cynefin, which is outside Croissants, and if you're not sure where Croissants is, you might know where Leeks department store is, McDonald's or KFC on the worst roundabout in Wales. So that's the kind of area from which he came. It was called the land of the Black Pyramids, which was the same coalfield as Adam's ancestors and family would have been part of. Land of the Black Pyramids because of the heaps of coal that was deposited on the side of the roads or wherever in Black Pyramids. And Carwyn was born there in the middle of the westernmost part of the South Wales coalfield. So, unbeknown to himself, he would have had a very political upbringing. He would have been aware of the conversations that the men would have had, that he would have heard as a little child when he was going to the shop, when they would go to one of the shops in Cynefin where there was a table and the men would gather there to play cards, and the little kids would run back and forth all the time as the men would play cards and put the world to rights and discuss their politics and discuss their religion. Carwyn would have been brought up in that atmosphere. But he wasn't particularly aware of that. He says so himself later on in life. But then he went to Gwendryth Grammar School, as it was then. Unfortunately, Gwendryth as a school is closed and merged with Maestar Alfabau today. He went to Gwendryth Grammar School, and there was, as often happens, there was one teacher there who changed things for him and who sparked all his imagination in different ways. And she was known as Miss Dora. And my father was in Gwenreth Grammar School as well, and I kind of grown up being aware of this mythical figure called Miss Dora. So it was kind of nice to go into the research for this to realise that she actually existed. And to find out that she was a big influence on Carwyn. And yes, I can read this in this light. That is excellent. I was worried about that, but I can read it. That's a bonus. So Miss Dora, as all good teachers, don't only teach the curriculum. They inspire their teachers to think outside the curriculum. And she did this. She used to take her pupils who studied Welsh with her to a house in the village of Drelach, where they could listen to radio broadcasts on the BBC for where Welsh poets would broadcast about Welsh literature, Welsh poetry, or Welsh history. And she'd take them so that they would have this extracurricular activity. And that had a huge influence on Carwyn. Carwyn talks about his school. I was supposed to study chemistry, physics and maths in the sixth form. That was the intention. But suddenly I came across the poetry of T.H. Parry Williams and was enchanted at a young age by his new style. He ploughed a new furrow. And I love the phrase, the way that Carwyn sums up what this poet did to Carwyn as a schoolboy. He ploughed a new furrow where the traditional was open to be enchanted by the new. I love that phrase. The traditional is open to be enchanted by the new. And that was the contribution of T.H. Parry Williams to Carwyn James in school. And as a result, he dropped chemistry, physics and maths, and he went on to do literature and history, etc., which he then went on to do in Aberystwyth. So that was a real major turn for Carwyn's political development. Why? Because it gave him a sense of what Wales was. In fact, what that did is exactly what Adam referred to when you were talking about making sure that your mirror is right. So that, for Carwyn, gave him that rear view mirror that he didn't have before. And then through that influence of Miss Dora, through the poetry of T.H. Parry Williams, that rear view mirror was put in the right place, and he could see behind him, and he could see, oh yeah, that's where I come from. And that was a massive realization for Carwyn. And he emphasized throughout his life the fact that history needs to be taught properly in schools, which meant we need to teach Welsh history in schools so that we do know where that mirror is, so that we do know where we've come from. So that was a big influence on him. As a schoolboy, he might not have articulated it in the way that that quote says at the time, but as the adult looking back, that's how he saw it. So that was a big step. And then Carwyn left Gwenreth Grammar School and he went to university in Aberystwyth. And there he came across other people from all over Wales who had recently become members of Plaid Cymru specifically. So this man who was born in Cefneithin, pretty much a Labour, Socialist Labour stronghold, to parents who had come from Cardigan, from Liberal Cardigan, he then discovered his own political party identity in Aberystwyth in university. And he became more than just active. He became more than active when he was there. He met other people who had become members of Plaid Cymru when they were in school, etc., etc. And then, if you do know your rugby, you will know of Onllwyn Brace, who used to play as a scrum half and played for Wales. And then also he went on to be one of the leaders in BBC Wales, in the sporting department in BBC Wales. But when Carwyn got to Aberystwyth, he couldn't get into the first team to play rugby because Onllwyn Brace's brother was the captain, playing in the same position as Carwyn, and in those days the captain chose the team. So this Onllwyn Brace's brother, John Brace, wasn't going to choose Carwyn over himself, so Carwyn couldn't get in. But then John Brace does refer, he let me know, he says, John Brace remembers Carwyn in college, and he says he let me know in midweek on one occasion that he wouldn't be available for a game the following Saturday for the second team, because he couldn't get into the first team because of John Brace. He was going with the university branch of Plaid Cymru to Tregaron to lie on the railway tracks there as a protest against British Rail's proposals to end the Carmarthen to Aberystwyth service. How topical that all of a sudden becomes once again, doesn't it? Yeah. So Carwyn said that it was important for him to be there. The act of lying down on the rail track shows how strong his principles were, is how John Brace sums up that young Carwyn's political awareness, that as much as he loved rugby, he knew that lying on those tracks was more important at that particular time for him. So his real political awakening happens in Aberystwyth. He becomes president of the Plaid Cymru branch, which everybody I spoke to for this book says was more of a kind of a social branch who met in a cafe in Aberystwyth, who weren't very politically active, but they were very active, if not party politically. They met together, and he was the president, and the secretary for a couple of years was somebody called, who we now refer to as Lord Alasdair Morgan, who was with Plaid Cymru, but then moved over to another party later on. At that time, Alasdair Morgan was the secretary to Carwyn's president of the Plaid Cymru branch in Aberystwyth. So Carwyn leaves Aberystwyth and going through 53 years of his life here in breakneck speed, and I hope I get to the end. He leaves Aberystwyth, and again, this man of dualities, this man from a pacifist chapel background, chooses to do his national service. Now, he could have deferred it, which probably increased the likelihood that he wouldn't have had to do it in the first place. He could have asked for exemption by doing a further study in college, but he didn't. He chose to go along with what was expected, and he went to do his national service. He ended up in the Navy, where other family members had been before him. So he went to the Navy, and he was immediately seconded to the Joint Services School of Linguistics, which was a very elite group of hand-picked people who were as a result of a government initiative to teach people the Russian language and the Russian culture, so that we would have a better intelligence base within the UK in order to spy and to eavesdrop, etc., on what was happening during the Cold War, the beginnings of the Cold War, behind the Iron Curtain. So Carwyn was part of this, and one of the biggest dualities that after 3.5 years of doing nothing but looking into this man's life, I still can't get my head round Carwyn the spy. But at the end of the day, he was. I was just thinking of this guy who was there in his suit and his rugby boots and his trousers tucked into his rugby socks, standing on the side of the pitch with his flag, and is he a spy? And the chap was deep in the back seat there with his hymn book, a spy, but he was. He learned Russian, he immersed himself in the Russian language, he immersed himself in Russian culture, and he was absolutely fascinated by that. And then he was on active service. He went out to Cuxhaven in Germany, where he was listening to messages from behind the Iron Curtain between the Russians and the East Germans, on command of GCHQ in Cheltenham. Carwyn was in the middle of all that. I still find it incongruous, but he did that. So that also would have contributed to his broader political awareness. He was playing his part in the political world stage at that time. A small part, I'm not over-exaggerating it, but he was part of it. He was there they would have been given lists of names they had to listen out to when the Russians were broadcasting messages behind the Iron Curtain. And Carwyn would have had a list of names, and if he heard one of those names, he had to make a note of that and pass on in which context that name was heard, pass it on to GCHQ, and then they did whatever they did. But that was a part, again, of his broader political awakening. But then we come to his time in Llandudno, when he was head of Welsh, first ever head of Welsh in Llandudno College, and he was becoming more and more party politically active by the time he was in Llandudno. And there was one particular issue that really sparked that interest with him, which was the proposed closure of Llandudno railway station. And that ignited a cross-party opposition, with Lady Megan Lloyd George, daughter of Lloyd George, being one of the lead campaigners were there. Gwynfor Evans was also there, and Caroline got involved with that particular battle, and they won that battle. And that was Caroline's first obvious political involvement in an issue with a specific party that really did make a difference. But one thing I find is interesting, which brings us, during his Llandovery days, he took part. It would be really interesting if we could get this circulated in some copies of it, but it's a very rare, I've seen it, but there was a programme in 1968 on the BBC called A Disunited Kingdom, with a question mark. It was a question, not a statement, it was a question. A Disunited Kingdom, and it was presented by a very young Sir Robin Day, if you remember your political broadcasting from years ago. Robin Day was a big, hard-hitting figure, but it was presented by him, and it looked at the whole issue of nationalism within the four different countries, and it's a really early example of, well, firstly, the BBC itself tackling and acknowledging such an issue in the first place, which I think is quite interesting. But the Welsh contribution came from Cameron. Now, he was given pretty much 10-minute slot to himself on that programme, whereas he was given the chance to tell the UK, the four countries, what he thought of Welsh nationalism, what he thought Wales was. What is Wales? Cameron was given the chance to say, this is what Wales is to me. And this is his clearest explanation of his own interpretation of his nationalism. And he gets a chance to do so on network BBC. So it's quite obviously quite revealing, because it says a great deal about him. I mean, I could read out chunks of it. I mean, I won't. He does. He starts off. It is very cliched, the programme itself. There's lots of sheep and choirs and rugby and the usual kind of stereotyping of what people from the outside think it is to be Welsh. But I suppose it was 1968, so we pardon them for that. But then Carolyn's section starts in showing Carolyn dropping a goal in the first game that he ever won his first Welsh cap at Cardiff Arms Park, and then it starts with that rugby, but that's understandable. And then Carolyn himself speaks. To be Welsh today is to be aware of an old vital tradition that has survived. It is also to feel a new sense of nationhood, which is at last finding full expression. No real serious attempt has been made by successive London governments to plan the Wales of today. Our people, our young people, are leaving the countryside. But depopulation is not confined to the rural areas. It is becoming more and more apparent in the industrial valleys as well. It is the duty of government to govern responsibly and to provide alternative industries in the mining valleys now facing doom. But day by day, the people of Wales are realising the futility of a government in which they had put so much faith. That's his opening statement. Pretty good, 1968, quite clear. And showing as well that he is becoming more and more aware, not just of a historical nationalism, I'm not belittling that is important, as Adam has already emphasised this evening, but he's becoming more aware not just of a historical nationalism, but a more real political economic nationalism, if you like, which that statement shows quite clearly. And then he puts that in the context from which he came himself personally, his own personal life. I was born and brought up in the industrial village Cefneithin, located literally under the shadow of the coal tips. As the son of a miner, I feel more at home here than I do in the agricultural area of North Carmarthenshire. The black pyramids I referred to earlier are part of the scenery, a symbol of economic wealth. it is sobering to think how much mineral wealth has left this valley. And today there is so little to show for it. And the future is bleak and uncertain. What is the future for these close-knit communities in the Rhondda Valley, in the Delice Valley, or in my own Gwendryke Valley? Already the unemployment figures are high in these areas, often 4 times the average for Britain as a whole. In the white paper on the Welsh economy, the completely unrealistic figure of 15,000 new jobs needed in Wales by 1971 was given. Professional economists put the figure at a minimum of 60,000. It may well be more. So Carwyn is getting more and more specific in his understanding of the political and economic needs facing Wales at the end of the 1960s. He's moved away from his traditional historical, literary understanding of his country, the one based on tales of Owain Glyndŵr, etc., etc. And he's moved completely away from that. And then, not long after that, he stood for Plaid Cymru in 1970, 2 years after that programme, as a candidate in the general election. Now, unfortunately, I suggested earlier that I didn't think Carwyn would make a good politician. The reason I say that is that awareness, that awakening, politically, economically, if you like, that's shown on the programme quite clearly and quite lucidly, didn't develop fully. And Carwyn's nationalism was still far too historical, literary, if you like, based on poetic. It was too much based on it, without the political realisms that he would have needed to take his stance further. So that's one reason, and then the other reason, as I suggested earlier, politics, I don't think for Carwyn was a game that he could have played very well. He wasn't that kind of person. He wouldn't have lasted. He wouldn't have gone any further. But he did contribute significantly to the development of the argument about what is Wales, and to presenting that argument outside of Wales as well, at a time when nationalism was beginning to be understood, Gwynfor winning command in 1966, etc. Now, Carwyn was part of the process of spreading that message outside, and that particular one particular programme is a very clear example of that. And there is another quote that, yeah, there you go. I'll finish with this one. Carwyn's involvement in politics, particularly after the 1970 election, kind of disappeared. He kept his allegiance to Plaid Cymru. He kept his fight for an independence for Wales. Yes, he did. But he wasn't active in any way, shape or form. It was interesting. I was out in Italy doing some of the research for this, because Carwyn lived in Italy for 2 years. And over the summer now we were out there again, and they were saying that they couldn't understand Carwyn's nationalism. He kept on saying that he kept on talking while he was in Italy that he wanted Wales to be independent. And the Italians said, why? Why would you want to be independent? And then as time went on, I began to understand why they were saying that. Well, they were saying, well, we were hundreds of independent states for so long, and now we've just come together under one nation. Now, why would you want independence again? So for them, it was a completely different challenge that Carwyn threw there. But he stuck to his belief in a historical basis of who Wales is, what Wales is, to a poetic basis of what Wales is. And then on that programme, Carwyn ends in the disunited kingdom. He ends the programme, his contribution to the programme in this way. And this comes back exactly again to what Adam was saying about the fact that no revolution has happened from the top down. It's happened the other way around. The central government in London has failed badly, and the only alternative is to see fulfilled the vision of the City Fathers. He's in the City Hall in Cardiff, making this piece to camera, surrounded by the statues that are there of former leading Welsh people from history. So he says that to see to fulfill the vision of the City Fathers. And I feel that the ultimate decision is in the hands of the Welsh people, in our hands. If we will it, it is ours. Nothing can stand in the way of the power of the nation. Thank you.